it's quite good to follow on from Linda, because the gentleman who set up where I work in 1995 was also went over. I'm just looking for Linda as the consultant to help Richard Friedman when they set up the centre there. So when I was there with Paul the other day, it's amazing. It's like going into my own centre. It's very similar, but within 4 or 5 years to see the technology you're using, it's amazing the change in that amount of time. So, but to introduce, my name's James Griffiths. I'm from the National Holocast Centre, which is in Nottinghamshire. I've tried to break my presentation into 3 bits, tell you a little bit about what we do, so it gives you the context, tell you about our digital project that we're trying to launch at the moment, and then to respond to the review. It's quite handy being last in a way, because everybody's covered what I had. So basically, where are we? Because even people down the road often don't know where we are. So we're actually in a really small village called Laxton, a few hundred people, which is in North Nottinghamshire. Somebody asked me today, why are you there? Well, it's literally a farmhouse that was owned by a family called the Smith family, who were living in the local coal town, and they actually went to Yad Vashem, learned about the Holocaust in the 80s, and said, why don't we know about it in the UK? And their parents gave over their home to turn it into a museum, and that's basically why it's in a very small area. So we're actually the only sort of centre that combines a museum, education centre, but also memorial gardens in the UK. You've got other places like Imperial War Museum in London, but not all 3 in one. We actually get about, for such a small place, about 25,000 visitors a year. Most of them are, 20,000 plus of them are from the age of 9 up to about 21 university students, A-levels and so on. But we actually house the only exhibition in Europe that teaches the Holocaust specifically to primary age children, which is getting less controversial, but people argue you shouldn't start that young, but we think we should. Sorry, let me just go back. So basically the journey then, I think just touching on a few points teaching it, I think Joanna, you touched on about making personal stories. 6 million people died in the Holocaust, and that's such a vast number, as Linda's slide had. We try to make it personal, and what the Journey exhibition does, it actually follows the story of a young boy called Leo, who's a 9-year-old German Jewish boy growing up in Berlin, and it follows his story in the month of November, December 1938. And the children that go through this, their age sort of 9 to 11, they're guided by an educator, but they follow this story of a young boy who's a fictional character, but based on real stories. Hopefully the technology will play. I'll give you a taste of what they see.
Diary, 5th of November 1938. We received a parcel from Grandma today. We were very excited. She always sends us nice things. In the parcel, there was a fantastic wind-up car for me and another doll for my sister Hannah. She was dancing around, singing to her doll. I love watching the car race across the floor. Mutti and Vati read Grandma's letter. I don't know what Grandma wrote, but Vati looked very serious. I think it might be more bad news. We have a nice life at home, but everyone seems so gloomy. Even Grandma wasn't smiling so much when we saw her last month. But I'm sure everything will be fine. Earlier today, I was out on Kaiserstrasse playing conkers with my best friend Fritz, when our neighbour, Mrs. Hindenburg, came along the street. She asked Fritz why he was playing with that Jewish child, meaning me. Fritz explained he's my friend. I could tell that made her angry. She said she would have to inform his parents. I don't understand why she thinks he shouldn't play with me.
So basically the exhibition is set up in quite a small area, set up in a series of rooms, and the children go around with an educator and the stories told to them. They actually learn about, they start off in his home, Leo's home with his parent in Berlin. They learn about what life was like in the home in 1938 with the rise of the Nazis at that time. They go into his schoolroom and Leo tells them about what was happening in school for Jewish children at this time. They also learn about what society did to the Jews in November 38 with Kristallnacht, and the fact his parents were forced to send him away. And it looks at the role of Britain with the kinder transports and these children, 10,000 children coming across on the trains to England in 38. And the exhibition ends there with the children coming across. So it's very, as you say, very personalised, so they can sort of connect in, and it's somebody who's their age.
I've seen.
I'm jumping ahead. Basically, what you haven't seen, this young girl, I know Paul will have seen this, I think you might have seen this, but this young girl tells the story, gives you sort of an insight into what it's like to go through it.
I've seen how people reacted to Leo and the Jews, and Hitler. I've seen that Hitler does not like the Jews, and he's ruining their lives. If I was Leo, then I would feel sad that I'm leaving my family, because I've got 3 sisters that take care of me all the time, and I don't know what's gonna come on the other end. I don't know if my new parents are gonna like me or not, are gonna treat me well, or I don't know, because but I don't want to go from my home. This Leo story from his actual diary is really breaking my heart, because why did the Nazis do this? Why? Just to get revenge on the Jews? Why? No point in doing that. You should be fair to everybody. It makes me feel really upset, because if I was around there, I would see if I could stop this. But even if I'm little, I would try. Even if Hitler would threaten me, I still would try. I would die in friendship.
So basically what she's saying is what she's learned from the rooms, and she talks about it, sort of missed it, but it talks about her having 3 sisters, and what she would do, she wouldn't just sort of back down, she'd say she'd try and die in friendship and so on. So it's sort of showing it's getting the children to think about what they would do in situations, you know, they try to link it to their own school life, what goes on, do they stand up, have they got the courage to do things and so on. We've actually got a more sort of older exhibition, which is for adults in secondary school, but it's designed for, as you say, over 12. It takes a more traditional approach. There's a lot less technology in this, you know, it's literally got 1 touch screen and maybe 1 TV in there, so it's all very sort of text-based. But what we also got is memorial gardens, which have got 1,000 white roses, which each tell a story. But this is where we are trying to use the technology to bring these stories alive, which I'll talk about slightly in a minute. But supporting all this is actually every day we have a survivor testimony at the centre. So we have 1 or 2 survivors speak a day. We've got about 40 survivors who speak for these children. So they actually got first-hand testimony where they can actually, you know, literally this close to them to get those stories. And this is one young lady's, if it plays, what she thinks of listening to a survivor.
I thought the visit to the Holocaust Centre was really interesting, and I especially liked when Simon Winston talked to us. I liked him sharing all his stories. I think it's important to hear the stories from the survivors, because you don't forget them, and you can refresh your memory, but it's telling it from a different point of view with someone who actually witnessed it.
So I think that's key, you know, the children, the adults, that is the sort of main part of their visit. You can actually learn about the Holocaust, but they can ask somebody who's actually there. The crucial bit, bringing in the digital for us now, is what do you do when the youngest survivor is about 75, the oldest is, you know, that we have is well into their 90s. What are you going to do when that element's there and you've simply just got the exhibition now? And this is where we think it's a crucial time where we've got to start to capture the testimony of our survivors, but not just capture it, because that's already been going on. We've got film footage of them, but we capture it in a way that as technology advances, we can actually access that technology, and what we want to do is make it interactive. There's a number of Holocaust organisations across the UK, across the world, but there's no sort of strategy about how we're going to do it. So we've sort of not led the way, because on your website, Leeds is the Shower Foundation in California, who are leading the way with filming survivor testimony holographically. It's an extremely expensive project. I don't know if you look on Paul's website, it will show you a bit about it, and it shows you the Stephen Smith, who actually set up our centre. He's the lead out in America now, working with Steven Spielberg. And literally, I think it's about 38 cameras surround the survivor, and they film them intensively. But what they're doing as well is they are asking them I'm not sure exactly, but I think it's thousands of questions that children have asked over the years. So the idea being that in the future, when these survivors are not there, the hologram will be there, and as the children, as you're sat there asking the hologram a question, it will answer as if that person was there. Now, that costs about $1 million to produce one of those. We've gone for, we call it, that's the sort of the Ford model, so a cheaper version. And the reason we've done that is because we want more than one survivor. So we're trying to film 10 survivors. We've raised enough money to film 5 at the moment. And the aim is that we get the rest of the money to get to 10, but we make it interactive. That's just been mocked up. I haven't got much more to show you than this at the moment, but that is one of our survivors being mocked up, what it would look like when he's no longer alive. This is our hall. You can see, we've got a big memorial hall. These are the adults and the children sat there. The survivor would normally talk to them, give their testimony for 45 minutes, and the children would ask a range of questions. And that's him mocked up now. What we're trying to work on with the interactive element of it is that it's got to be quite sophisticated, because the children can ask very sort of superficial questions. Have you ever seen Hitler? Well, they might say yes or no, but some of them can ask some really deep religious, moral questions. You know, one asked the other day about, you know, did you do anything that you would say is wrong in the camps? And one of the survivors, who was in Bergen-Belsen, said that he'd actually was responsible for handing out the soup, and he made sure the peels were kept to the bottom so he could feed his brother more food. And he says, you know, I put my hands up that somebody might have died as a result of that, but my brother survived. So you can get really deep questions about then, does that go against what your religious beliefs are, and so on. So we've got to try and tease them out, and that's through making sure that we record. So at the moment we're recording all the questions that are asked every day by all these children, so that we can feed it in. When I mentioned this morning, Bright White, who are doing it with the Glasgow School of Arts for us, will be able to film these survivors. It'll take a week per survivor, and they'll film him and ask the questions to them. Also, we've got to be very sophisticated, because if I stood there and asked the questions, the survivor would answer in a much different tone and sophistication to me. So this is where we've got to bring in different age group audiences, so the survivor will answer in an age-specific way. So in the future, when we've got the 9-year-olds asking this interactive survivor, the answers will be at that level. So I can't tell you too much about the sophistication, that's beyond my understanding of it, but that's our digital project. As I say, it's going to cost us around £1 million to do that, and it's already been mentioned today about Heritage Lottery Fund and other funders. We're not government funded where we are, because we, as you say, I know we've got national in our title, but we're nationally styled, not, as you say, like the Liverpool Museum. So we try and increase our standards so we can produce the best standards possible for the public. We do have other projects on the go, such as developing our website so that we can digitalise our archives to give more access to the public. But the issues that you've all raised this morning and this afternoon are the ones we face. We've got a fancy website coming on, we'll have our archives on, we just haven't got the staff to respond always to the feedback, and that's where this loop, can't remember who
Simon.
yeah, this is where we're trying to be participatory, but we just can't always keep up with it. It's the same with, we're on Facebook, social networking, and yet we just can't keep up with that either. So it's that decision between, you know, how much do we use digitalisation and in what ways to engage with the public, or are we actually doing them a disservice by using them but then not actually responding and engaging. Most of the things I was going to say about the response to the critical review have already been sort of mentioned, but I just felt that, I think somebody said this morning about it being quite a lot of literature in there. I thought the whole thing was really useful, and that's already been mentioned, but I thought, I think it was Parry had raised the issue of, you know, fetish in the future and neglecting the past. I think, you know, with this sort of project, when they've done carefully, what you're doing is enhancing you know, you're using what's in the past for generations today, for future generations, and that's not, the technology there shouldn't overcome the sort of benefits of keeping, you know, what we've got today in the future. So I thought that was important, because the other thing I wanted to say, at the moment, that survivor will travel by train, often from across the UK. We get people from Leeds that come down to us, and they normally can only speak at a certain time, so maybe 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and then they've got to go back home. it's also very emotionally draining for them. In the future, that person can be shown in multiple locations at multiple times, so the audiences will open up, and that means obviously there's more engagement with that then. I think yourself and Michael, you were saying about Roosevelt. I have asked the question, what happens when somebody asks a question that can't be answered, but they seem to think the technology is there at the moment to do it all. I think, and then yeah, I just brought up, I think that's covered, but I think the main thing from the review is really useful for myself and my colleagues as well. It's good to know that, in a way, other organisations are facing similar things about digitalisation, and I suppose on the other level it's good, this is a form of professional development for us that we don't often get the chance to have. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, James. We're going to run a little bit over time, but we can be quite relaxed and flexible about that, can't we?
We've got two speakers in the final session, so if we go over a little bit, it's not we'll still finish by 5.
Cool. And so to open things up to the floor, and do comments or questions for discussion.
Can I ask a question to you, James, about, I was thinking about in terms of resources, in terms of kind of, and this is something that we got when we were talking in South Africa about the various Holocaust projects. I mean, in lots of ways, it's a really interesting tension between the whole personalisation agenda that we've been talking about all day, and also about common cause. And in some ways, there's a real kind of common cause, isn't there, that all your centres globally are facing a fundamental conundrum of the fact that you're moving into a phase of kind of the next generation. So you're moving into a kind of like post-memory phase, and it's about kind of bridging that gap. Has there been any kind of interaction across all the centres, including with Spielberg, to try and join all this stuff up? So in some ways, using the fact that Spielberg's project will also be able to be seen in multiple sites, and so is there a sense that everybody could kind of jump on that bandwagon, if you like, and your survivors, to call them that, could then interact with the Spielberg project, and you could kind of all do into that thing, as opposed to everybody trying to fundraise for their specific projects? Or is there still kind of too much politics in order to do that?
So you might want to edit this.
Yeah.
It's not joined up. I think that's the sort of bottom line answer. We've got multiple organisations in the UK, we've got globally, and I can't talk about what's going on in South Africa, but I know the technology that's used in America isn't the technology we could use over in our country unless you bought very expensive equipment. So, like I said, one of those, if we wanted to purchase one hologram, would cost probably £500,000. But that would be outside, when we could purchase maybe one, but then you've only got one story. And we're saying, the Holocaust isn't, one story, it's multiple stories, and we need to show those, So the strategy, there's no joined up strategy as such. And that's why we've had to take the lead that's right for our centre. I know the Holocaust Education Trust is talking about second generation and working down that line. We're not saying that one is right over the other, it's just each organisation's got preferred ones. I think where it is trying to be joined up at the moment, the Prime Minister's Commission in this country, the Holocaust Commission, they just visited us at the end of April, and they've brought on board a digital company to look at this, to see what role the UK plays in trying to pull this all together, and that commission is going to report to the Prime Minister at the end of this year. So it'll be interesting to see what they say about survivor testimony. And I know what we've just presented, what I've briefly said to you was presented to them to sort of feed into that review. So wait till December, we might know a bit more.
I'm really interested, because it comes back to this question we've talked about a lot today, about the relationship between the physical and the digital. And the fact that when the kids go through Leo's story, and they are engaging with various different digital mechanisations through that, but there's actually that physicality of being in a group, moving through like a group of children at any time, and that ability to talk to each other and communicate. And it comes back to this notion of place, which I think was really, really important in what Joanna was saying about
think, you know,
The National Trust.
I think that's an interesting one there. We've taught the journeys, as you say, is unique in the sense for young children to go through. It's very well, it needs an educator basically. So you're right, you go through in this group, and we've talked about putting it on a mobile bus, or we've talked about Glasgow School of Arts has said, I might be wrong on some of these things, but they called it, like, I was up there at the end of last year, and you can have what they call a cave. So and you can go in, so we could recreate it anywhere in a sense through technology. They're confident you could do that. But we were saying there's nothing, we actually come down to the basis to be together and go through as a group and be in that place actually adds a great deal to that experience, which we think might be lost.
Because we do quite a lot of work at Leeds on cave technology and looking at it in relationship to heritage, and I mean mainly around medieval sites. Through that notion of intangible heritage and how do you make the intangible tangible and what's below the ground. And again, with the National Trust, of course, they have many sites that there's very little physically left. And the value of place is actually in trying to recreate what that medieval monastery looked like or what that Cistercian abbey was like. And so I think this, but it comes back to that interaction of the people.
Yes, and I think that's what we've sort of, whether we're right or wrong, we've sort of come back to that, whether, is it better to have multiple journeys across the UK? Because the argument is, how do you expand your audience? Not many children can get to where we are because of our location. So how do you give access to children across the UK to that? We've already talked about, the islands in Scotland as well. But do you have multiple locations of that? And people have all got different views on that.
And accessibility is a key challenge in the review. The notion of if so few state primaries could now afford to travel anywhere.
Yeah, and that's I've spent a lot of time with talking to head teachers, and the biggest factor they say is travel costs. We all know that. Just one other point, we're talking about the cave. We've got a ghetto in our you've got in yours, Linda, haven't you? And we were talking about this whole cave technology, but. The ghetto itself is was a traumatic experience for the victims of the Holocaust. What would we be doing to a visitor if you create it so realistically with smell, touch? What would they come out the other end with? So that's consideration for the audience as well.
There's that interesting critique that's been made of the Imperial War Museum's trench activity, and then the way Libeskind used architecture to create emotion through walking through space in Salford. So I think there's lots of interesting things being done about that.
One question. I mean, I've got kind of a follow-up to that, I suppose. When we're thinking about the way that place has this ability to create responses which you might not get otherwise. I mean, it seems that on the one hand, digital technology can enable you to create places which perhaps no longer exist or are inaccessible. But on the other hand, it also has the ability, on occasion, if you want it to remove that notion of place, to kind of depersonalize the space. So I wonder what people think, about the relative merits of using technology in one particular way. I mean, should we always wish that digital technology kind of emphasizes or recreates the kind of feeling of being located somewhere? Or, are people kind of comfortable with the idea that technology can be used to also kind of detach people from places in order to make things more accessible? I mean, thinking mainly on sort of mobile platforms and remotely. I mean, are there any kind of arguments either way on that?
I was thinking the same things with Trellis and the move to the trust of the mobile technology, and where you were hoping people would most often interact with that mobile technology, because of course you can do it at home, but actually the value of it is being on the site and using it. So where your focus is, because again, back to the notion of place, is it more important that you're looking at an app around Nostell, standing at Nostell, or sitting in my office at the university?
We think about a visitor journey sort of starting before somebody actually leaves home to visit somewhere. So it could be that their first engagement with a particular place is via that mobile phone. they may then visit somewhere, have a great experience, and then once they've actually left that place, continue to interact. And perhaps one example of that, I think you mentioned a similar thing actually before, was we've been doing some work at Cragside, which is a big property up in Northumberland, where Lord Armstrong, who was an inventor, basically is the sort of person who created Cragside. And he's a very strong character, and he's very close to the hearts of a lot of people in the North East. So on Twitter very often what we have is somebody playing the role of Lord Armstrong or other people in Lord Armstrong's family. And often I think it's people who've been to Cragside who actually take part in that and ask questions and interact. But from our point of view, it's continuing to sort of deepen that engagement with Cragside as a place and what Cragside is about. So we're not bothered that they're doing that from their bedroom or wherever they are, because it's still just engaging them with that place. So I don't really mind, to be honest, at what point, where they physically are when they're engaged, as long as it helps to deepen their relationship with that place.
There are things you could do with augmented reality which would be very much site-specific. So you could be recreating buildings actually superimposed upon the present site.
Yeah.
You're looking at your camera and there it is. Association Abbey work in with Manx and things,
absolutely,
which you can talk to.
Yeah.
That would be the sort of very site-specific application.
Amazing in terms of literature, just to finish off that bit about going, reading, or interacting with your app and going to the site, and then it's like a lot of the literature that was written about the role of the catalogue in the art gallery exhibition in the 90s, and about the notion of what does the catalogue bring to it. And when we were all very, very absolutely rightly concerned about accessibility and engaging audiences, there was a lot of interesting stuff written about the language of the catalogue and where someone would read the catalogue and the affordability of the catalogue. And I think that's one of the other things. We talk very openly about, well, everyone has this technology, but actually there's still, as you raised about South Africa, there's a huge economic value. I don't personally choose to go out and buy a £400 tablet, because I don't want my child to read on it. But there's a lot of people who can't do that. And I think we've got to also consider accessibility issues around, very few of us still have enabled tablets that allow us to do all these really exciting things. All broadband that are now having broadband that doesn't.
And what the implicit assumption also, I think, is that people who have this kind of technology will always want to use it when they go to these places. So enabled and encouraged users sometimes make a very conscious decision that when it comes to ideas around heritage and experiencing that their own mobile technology is not part of that. So I think that there has to be an awareness and appreciation that actually for some people there is a time and a place for a digital encounter to augment or enhance or further their experience. And that's not necessarily all the time. So I think there's kind of two different groups there.
And it's the same literature that's about the label. All that stuff in the 80s was written about the label, the idea that you were looking at the label rather than painting. And I think that's one of the things we need to think about, that a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the critical questions around technology are actually critical questions that have been around interpretation for a very, very long time. From the moment we started thinking about, actually, we really do need to engage these audiences and not just shut the door and look after and polish our collections.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the Trust sort of view around interpretation in terms of putting some, a physical piece of kit in somewhere like Fountains Abbey, for example, is that it may not be appropriate because people will be turned off by that because they think it's intrusive and it spoils the spirit of Fountains Abbey, which is why we're very keen on personalisation in terms of people being able to choose how and when they access information on their mobile phone. And if you don't want to, you can leave it at home, sort of thing. So it is about making sure that we're meeting people's needs and not forcing it on people.
But that's why I quite liked this idea that all the strategies, whether it's commercial or engagement, is kind of governed by the sites and the actual heritage content itself, because that gives you a good rationale for excluding it in certain cases where it's deemed sort of not to be appropriate or desirable on the part of visitors.
The other thing that struck me today is everything we've looked at is mixed media. In the fact that, I'm working on Cragside at the moment, and one of the really useful work we're doing is around the notion of, we're working on electricity, and the teleology of modernism, the idea that whatever is new is the best thing to use and will replace everything that came before. And of course it's never like that, Same time they had electric lights in Cragside, they're also still using candles. And it's that notion of, like, somewhere like Kirkstall Abbey having the board that you can go up and read at the same time as having the app, and giving that multiple approach to it.
Can I just say something about space as well? I mean, we're talking more and more about space. And I wonder, I'm just thinking back to the first kind of couple of presentations we had today. Are we talking about space because we're talking about spacing? Right? So what about if you're interested in the heritage of Alfred Hitchcock? Yeah? Would we be thinking about space in the same way? You know, do we need to... Now, clearly there's loads of movie-induced tourism. I was in San Francisco recently and I did the kind of vertigo tour and all that stuff, right? Yeah, I love that stuff. But is there something else going on there as well? And are we... Is the optic that we're using skewing the way that we're thinking about this engagement? I don't know what people think. You know, is space the dominant issue? Because it seems to be, from the way that we're talking, in lots of ways, we're kind of using the digital to bring visitors in, to get people thinking, enhancing their experience of the museum. Is that because that's what we're thinking about? Or is that actually sort of central to our experience of heritage? Do we have to kind of locate heritage somehow?
I struggled a little bit in terms of trying to get to grips with what you were meaning by heritage in the paper, and I deliberately sort of excluded to a certain extent the work that we do around wildlife, for example, and biodiversity, because although I would consider that to be part of cultural heritage, I didn't feel that that was part of what you were referencing in the paper, and I think perhaps it does need either narrowing in or widening out, but it needs to be perhaps a bit more explicit about what it is you're actually referring to.
And if you open that up, would that change? Would that change how we prioritise the digital within an engagement with that kind of heritage?
Probably would. We need to think through in some detail what impact it would have, but it probably would, yeah.
But I think there's sometimes an intangible aspect. I just recently, this past week, South Africa held a general election. So since our first democratic election, 1994, elections, it's a big thing. It takes on something beyond an election. It's almost nation building, if you will. And this time around, there was particular excitement. Everybody was tweeting, anybody, all the parties, there was a huge buzz. The Independent Electoral Council, they had an app for people like in the form of a game, so they can learn more about how to vote and all. So it was an information program, sure, but it was almost creating an intangible history in a way on a digital platform, which you can't really quantify, but you get the feeling that it veers from just using digital to almost a cultural experience, because it's different South Africans from different backgrounds all coming together.
And in some ways, though, that also then brings up kind of issues that we were talking about earlier on about trying to bring disparate collections together to try and make the intangible tangible, and actually trying to create some sort of physical presence.
If you ever had to teach children about non-digital era, would you use digital technology to do it?
Probably wouldn't, you know.
I just think it's almost strange that we've talked a lot about the process of making physical things digital in order to kind of increase whatever it is, accessibility, or increase kind of the level of engagement that we have with people. But there's this kind of, the technology is moving now such that we can actually use the digital material which we can harvest from these physical things to create objects, with 3D printing, or to create whole environments for people to stand and sort of experience. So it seems almost like we're talking now about using the digital as kind of a medium through which the physical is reinterpreted, rather than being transformed into something which is stuck within a piece of digital hardware. So that particularly in the case of the Holocaust museums, I thought that was very interesting. That actually it was about transforming the environment and people's experiences in the kind of physical environment through using digital tools.
The interesting in relation to that is actually how much work we're doing to counter the digital with young people at the moment, which brings back the physical. So just in terms of a lot of the work we've done through the Discovery Centre and the work that we're doing through our collections at Leeds is about reconnecting young people with physically holding objects and exploring objects. So as part of the EPQ project we're doing, we've had them in our history and philosophy of science collections, starting with an object and a set of questions to learn how you do effective research searches. And actually, there was a lot of pressure to have a day where they'd be there with laptops, and we're going to work in front of images and texts and objects. And there was almost this, I always felt with the teachers as well, because every teacher you meet nowadays has their iPad. I think we don't get iPads at the university, but anyway. And it's that sort of that constant source. Oh, we're talking about Henry Moore, okay, right, yeah, okay, I've got what. And it's that interesting interaction. So there's that almost that reverse thing that we're looking at maybe in museums, in terms of trying to value what a museum is as a depository, or what a library is as a depository of these really important tangible things.
At least until 2020.
At least until 2020.
Then we're not buying books.
That really worried me.
Well, they wouldn't be printing them too.
Yeah. Anyway, perhaps now is a good time to break for 10 minutes or so to grab a coffee, and then we've got a couple more speakers before our closing discussion.
Yeah, should we just do 10 minutes and kind of you come back at 20 past? And
Yeah. That's great.
Good.